Pleasure to be back here again. Like Joan, I guess I passed the test because I'm back here second year in a row, so thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here. Last time I was here, I spent a lot of time telling you about myself and about my policies and my view of the world, and I did that with the purpose of trying to help you understand where I wanted to take the Department of General Services. And my priority then, as it is now, is to foster within General Services that customer service orientation that we should have. I want to balance that against General Services control functions and harmonize the two of them in a way that will provide not only good services to our customer departments, but to our vendor communities and the other partners that we work with. Today I'm going to mention to you, as I get into my remarks, a little bit a new initiative for DGS that is very much on the minds of Ameritech and was mentioned by Assemblymember Joan Buchanan. But before I do that, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I've done the past year at the department that led us to this initiative as a part of an overall approach with the department. DGS is tasked with responsibility in state government as a control agency. It is our responsibility to oversee many of the business operations of state departments, including the procurement process, and to make sure that they are consistent with the state's statutory goals, responsibilities, and the administration's policies. Sometimes, unfortunately, though, that control function overshadows what is our other major responsibility, which is to provide good services to our departments. DGS is tasked with making sure that the departments in state government get the goods and the services and the real estate that they need to implement their missions. And as I mentioned, what I want to do is harmonize those two within the department and encourage that culture that will allow us to both fully maintain and scrupulously ensure that departments are following the statutes and the policies of the state, while at the same time making sure that we can get them to a yes answer instead of a no answer. To help me do that, I needed to reach out, needed to find out what DGS is doing well and what it's not doing so well, and did that in several ways. I met with 16 directors that represent some of the largest customers and partners of DGS. We put out a customer satisfaction survey, issued it to over 10,000 state employees that interact with DGS to get their feedback as well. I had several town halls with our own staff to get their thoughts about what DGS does well and what it doesn't do so well. And I also set up an anonymous suggestion box in which folks could let me know what they think without necessarily revealing who they are, in a way that would encourage more disclosure and more thoughtfulness about what DGS can do better and what it's doing well and should emulate throughout the department. We took all that information and turned it into action plans in each of the divisions to follow up on the comments that we received and are actively pursuing those action plans to implement changes within DGS. At the same time that we've been reaching out to our customer departments, we've also been reaching out to our partners in the vendor community. Jim Butler, who is sitting down here, and I'm remiss for not introducing, is the state's chief procurement officer, the deputy director of our procurement division, and someone that many of you know well. Jim, in particular, has been tasked with reaching out to the vendor community, especially on the IT side, to get their input and their thoughts on what DGS should be changing and what it should be pursuing in the way of doing better or continuing to do what it does well. Last May, I had the opportunity to meet with 14 member representatives of TechAmerica and get their views on IT procurement in particular within the state. And Jim has been reaching out in other venues, in particular launching a new initiative to look at the standard terms and conditions in our procurement contracts. One aspect of that outreach was the first of what I think will be several forums in which we called in the vendor community and asked them for their input on terms and conditions, how they would like to see them changed, where we can find some grounds for agreement that would allow the vendor community to have an easier time engaging in contracts with the state, and still allow the state to ensure that it's in compliance with the statutes and laws that it needs to follow. I understand it was well received. I think we got a lot of good input from the vendor community. And one of the things that we heard there and in previous communications, including a significant white paper that TechAmerica issued, was the vendor community's interest in doing more negotiated procurements, 6611, as has been mentioned here a couple of times already this morning. And we heard that, and for some time we've been considering expanding the 6611 process. Back probably February or March, Jim and I started talking about how we can engage 6611 in a way that would be more effective and use it more often. Historically, as I'm sure all of you know, the model for state procurements has been the sealed bid process, in which the state tries to write down all of its requirements for a procurement, and the vendors try to write down all the ways that they will respond to those requirements. And then we open those bids and see if we've got anybody that was able to match up to a T what we asked for and what the vendors can provide. It's a process that works well for some commodities. It often doesn't work well in certain large procurements for technology because they are complex. They're interrelated with a lot of legacy systems, and the business problems that they're trying to solve are themselves complex. It's a process that is deficient in that sense because it doesn't provide very much opportunity to ask questions, to allow the vendors to suggest alternatives. There isn't very much opportunity to look at varying levels of service or types of service in this process. It's pretty much take it or leave it. The result has been, as we get into IT procurements over the years, that we have failed procurements. As I mentioned, and as you all know well, these are complex issues, and when we try to communicate with each other only through a limited amount of writing, not the opportunity to actually have a conversation, to educate each other, more and more we found that we were getting procurements that failed in one sense or another. Either we got no bids, nobody was compliant with these detailed rules that we wrote down and requirements that we expected people to follow precisely. And so we ended up with a lot of frustration in the state. And you know, it was enough frustration that a lot of folks just wanted to tear their hair out. The traditional process discouraged an exchange of information. It had an objective of eliminating favoritism and ensuring objectivity so that the state could be sure that it was fair in its processes, and it attempted in its sealed bid two-envelope process to ensure that the state would get a good price. This process was not designed to be maddening. It wasn't the intent to make this as frustrating as possible. But since probably the first government in human history, there have been questions about the fairness of procurements. Probably the first time any government tried to buy anything, there were accusations of favoritism or unscrupulous activity. And this long history of questioned procurements led to a bunch of statutes that now significantly bind what we're allowed to do and put us in something of a straitjacket when it comes to actually negotiating or having conversations with the vendor community. Unfortunately, as well-intended as those rules are, and as I mentioned, the more complicated that the procurements have gotten in the IT world, the reverse has happened, and we've had a lot of frustration and a large outcry, I guess I would say, a chorus of complaints that the process doesn't work well. And so we've kind of gone full circle from trying to ensure that we have fairness to now complaining that the effort to be fair and to invite competition is doing exactly the opposite. It's not allowing the state to achieve the kind of procurements it needs, and it sometimes ends up not being fair because we end up with no solution to the problem that we set out to solve. Because of that, in 2003, a legislation was enacted that created Public Contract Code 6611, which, as Assemblywoman Buchanan pointed out, provided the Department of General Services with the authority to negotiate contracts. It was very broad, and it actually loosened the shackles considerably on what DGS could do in the way of procurements. Unfortunately, this tool was not vigorously pursued in DGS. As I mentioned, the atmosphere and the culture that developed over the years of ensuring that we have fairness, objectivity, that there are no sweetheart deals, created within the minds of the procurement professionals a certain hypersensitivity to ensuring that they're following all of those strictures. And so to suddenly be given all of this freedom to negotiate was not something that I think procurement officials were very comfortable with. It was also unclear what guidelines should be used in this process, since DGS was authorized to invent the process for the most part. And then I think just the general nature of folks not being comfortable with change. Even though this provision was here in 2003, it was not actively pursued. Until 2009. I think there was a change in leadership and continuing chorus of outcries for doing IT procurements in particular differently. And DGS started to use this. We used it with MyCalPays, with the Caltrans construction management system, and with FisCal. It turned out that this was a very good process. FisCal in particular demonstrated to us the kind of savings and the kind of solutions that we could arrive at. The FSR for FisCal originally envisioned a process and a system for implementation that would have cost about $1.6 billion. At the end of the process, it's going to be around $0.6 billion, 60% savings over what we thought. And to a large extent, that was because of this negotiation process that allowed more conversation to occur between the state and the vendors and helped the state better understand what options were available to it and allowed the vendors to better understand what the state needed. Because of the success of these efforts since 2009, and because of listening to TechAmerica participants in particular, but others in the vendor community, what I want to talk about today and announce is that DGS is proposing a new procurement process, an expanded use of 6611, that will, we think, streamline the processes for departments in negotiations, add flexibility to the circumstances under which negotiations can be used, and clarify the negotiation process. Tomorrow, DGS will release a draft of proposed changes to the state contract manual, which we would like to get feedback from you all on, that we think will address many of the concerns that have been voiced over time on our procurement processes. And at this point, I want to give you just a high-level summary of what you'll see beginning tomorrow in the way of this proposed change. First, the conditions under which 6611 can be used will be in the state contracting manual. One of the complaints we've heard is that to the extent that we have used 6611, it's not been real clear what the rules were. To the extent that anything was written down about the processes, it was largely in what we call administrative orders, which are largely documents internal to DGS that provide guidance to our own staff, not generally available to the public. What we will do from now on is make sure that they're published in the state contracting manual and visible to all. We are also reducing the signature authority, moving it down from the responsibility of the director of DGS to authorize the use of 6611 and allowing it to be implemented by the deputy director for procurement, which we hope will speed up the process of authorizing 6611. And we are expanding the possible uses, the situations in which 6611 can be used. At the outset of a procurement, as we did with FisCal, during a procurement in which we have at least one responsive bidder, which was the case in the Caltrans project, and even during a procurement where we've received no responsive bids, which was the case with the unemployment insurance modernization project, where The traditional process resulted in no responsive bidders, and we used the authority of 6611 to pick up a negotiated process, and ultimately were able to complete a procurement, and that system is well underway. In addition, these proposed changes will provide updated and more extensive guidance on when and how to use 6611, so that the departments will have a clearer sense of what their opportunities are. By using this process, we will develop templates, including documents that explain how to identify the scope, schedule, and the strategy for negotiation. DGS will proactively engage the purchasing department, or what we call the sponsoring department, at the outset of a possible 6611 procurement to ensure that they understand what their roles and responsibilities are. And as needed, DGS will provide training to the sponsoring department staff to ensure that they understand what the procedures will be and what's involved in a negotiation process, and what the expectations are of that department in pursuing it. In addition, this process outlines roles for participants in the negotiated process. To me, this is perhaps the most important feature outside of the general concept itself, which I'll mention in a second, of the process. It formally acknowledges that, at least in a procurement where DGS is involved, that there will virtually always, I can't think of an instance where this wouldn't be true, be three key participants in the procurement process: the sponsoring department, the technology agency, and DGS. In addition, we may have other teams, depending upon the type of the procurement and the nature of what we're doing, that participate in negotiations or evaluations of proposals. This is something that in the past has sort of been used ad hoc. We invented it as we went along, and we will now propose to institutionalize this idea of having these teams do this negotiation. Ultimately, someone has to be responsible for the overall process, and that would either be DGS or CTA, depending upon the circumstances. And they will be responsible for the overall process. If anything goes wrong, they're going to be the one that's called on the carpet. If anything goes right, they can take credit. But in terms of this official responsibility, it isn't as real as what happens in practicality, and that is that there really is a team that does it. There needs to be someone at the table who understands the overall procurement process, the rules, the policies of the state, the things like small business participation and whether or not we can contract with Darfur, and whether or not we've got recycling content that's appropriate and meets our state goals, and small businesses are participating, who understands conflict of interest issues. And we also need, obviously, at the table for an IT procurement, the technology agency, which sets the state standards for architecture and the policies surrounding equipment and services, and where the state is going from an architectural standpoint in the technology realm. And then, of course, we need the sponsoring department. Neither the technology agency nor DGS truly understand the business problem. Only the sponsoring department gets what it is it ultimately needs out the back end, and so it needs to be a vital participant in the negotiations. We're envisioning in our proposal that all three of these entities would need to have a sign-off in the process, and essentially any one of the three could veto a procurement if, in their areas of expertise, they think something is amiss. But I'm envisioning that is unlikely to happen, because in most cases, it's been my experience, where there's good communication, where there's good interaction, folks usually find a solution, particularly if they are looking to find a solution in the first place. In negotiation procedures, we are proposing some specific procedures that, again, would be highlighted and written down for everyone to see. A key component of this, as I mentioned, would be using the negotiation team. On the slide here, you can see a couple of the other points that are involved in the negotiation rules that we're proposing. But I want to bring your attention to number 4 in particular. This is, I think, the real key of why we're doing more 6611, why we should do more negotiated procurements. And I want to read the first sentence out loud. The negotiation process may include persuasion, alteration of assumptions and positions, give and take, and may apply to price, schedule, requirements, or other terms of the proposed contract. To me, that is really the essence of what this negotiation is about and why we should have this in state government, particularly with respect to IT procurements. The negotiation process, to me, is less about developing a good deal, either for the vendors or for the state, than it is about mutual education, about coming to understand, in the case of the state, what the problem is that needs to be solved, and in the case of the vendors, what their systems can do to help solve that problem. So the negotiation process, to me, is not so much about the deal as it is about understanding how we can arrive at a solution. It's the thing that's been missing from procurements in these complex situations in the past. I should note at this point, too, that this negotiated procurement and use of 6611 is not something that would be exclusively used in the IT arena. DGS will be proposing to expand this to all of its procurement types where it's appropriate and where we think it fits. And there are a number of instances in that case that are outside the IT arena. Finally, the award procedures will also change somewhat. Traditionally, the states always required a final written proposal that was evaluated against the original bid requirements. We've found that that often doesn't work very well for the reasons that I mentioned. During negotiations, it's not uncommon for folks to come up with new ideas, new proposals, and ultimately, human judgment needs to be incorporated into the decision-making process, which means that inevitably there's a certain amount of subjectivity. 6611 is a powerful tool. It's one that's been vastly underutilized in the state, and we're coming to realize that and pursuing the expansion of 6611. But because of the nature of it, it is also subject to abuse. As we said at the outset, the reason we have all of these rules was to prevent abuses, to ensure fairness, eliminate favoritism. This process is a lot less defined. It's a lot more open-ended in terms of how we can arrive at a conclusion and the values that go into that conclusion. So it's important that we put some accountability measures around this. And 3 of the most important accountability measures that we are including here is the notion of the transparency. As I mentioned, we will have rules. The process will be understood by all parties entering into it. And if there are any concerns, they can be raised at the outset of the use of the negotiation process. Another accountability measure is the use of the team. It will be clear who is participating. As I mentioned, it will have at least, I think, 3 participants, could be more. We think that that will limit the extent to which any vendor would have a certain leg up in the process, or the process would be subject to influence. And then finally, we will be documenting the decisions and explaining what the outcome was and why we arrived at that outcome. And then I wanted to just note the applicability of all of this to industry's concerns. One of them, as I mentioned, was updating 6611 and making sure that it was in the state contract manual so that everyone understood what the rules were and what the process was. Increasing the use of negotiations, obviously, that's the point of all of this. No limit to the scope of what's negotiated. We do see that as being very, not completely open-ended, but largely so. These proposed rules also will provide an opportunity for the suppliers to have input. We are asking for your feedback on these proposals before any decisions are made about whether or not and in what fashion they would go into the state contract code. And then reporting information. As I mentioned, one component of what we propose is to document the outcome of the procurement process. One thing I should add in closing is that this might sound a little confusing given that there was some recent legislation that authorized CTA to use 6611 and some discussion now about the possibility of moving IT procurements to the technology agency. And there really isn't an inconsistency here in DGS pursuing this initiative for several reasons. One is that 6611 still requires DGS to establish the procedures and the policies for using 6611. The negotiation process by statute is to be defined by DGS. So for the time being, until the statutes change, that is a responsibility of DGS. Secondly, as Carlos mentioned, the administration has kicked off a thoughtful process about whether and how much of the IT procurement activity should be transferred to CTA. Carlos and I are both involved in that and both committed an open mind, and I don't think it was hard for either of us because we've both long said that where it goes is less important than how it's done. And what we need to do first is talk about how the process for procuring IT can be fixed, and then hopefully it will be self-evident where to locate it. So this is an attempt to talk about what is wrong with the procurement process, how we can fix those things through the use of 6611, and really runs independently of where it would be located as an organizational responsibility in the future. In addition, we think that even if procurements do transfer over to the technology agency, this process will help inform their own decision-making. The input that we receive will obviously be public, shared with everyone, and will be transparent. So, as I said, it runs independently of considerations about organizational structure and responsibilities. That concludes my remarks. I just want to encourage you to give us feedback when we send this out to you all. We'll be putting out not only the changes to the contract manual itself, but hopefully a summary to walk you through what we're doing and why we're doing it. And we look forward to continuing to work with TechAmerica on improving the procurement process in state government. Thank you.